like thinking about data visualization and data preparation in the sort of context of like LLMs and like how to assess what LLMs are doing, given that they will always return like something if you ask them to create a chart or clean your data. Um, cool. Okay, so about this talk, it's based on this blog post that has been floating around. It actually has a very boring name. Like Gina sent it around with a much more fun name, like Anatomy of a Well-Designed Blood Helper. I gave it a much more boring name. And I also gave a version of this talk for the Statistical Society of Australia and the Melbourne R user network. And back in August 2025, so last year. I very quickly put this together. But basically, I thought I had promised Gina this talk, but also my own selfish reasons for giving this talk are I'm about to teach statistical programming at LMU. And one thing I've been really interested about is like, how do we teach students to sort of reason about and write better functions? Nick Tierney, who some of you might be familiar with, he's the author of a bunch of R packages, including Narnia and I think VisDat was a visualization package on missing data, plus a bunch of other really fun things. And he gave a talk, he gave a couple of versions of this talk about functions and like how to write functions. I'm also thinking about like, you know, ways to quantify or test this sort of like usability or like niceness gain from like having a better designed plot helper. And then there's some links to sort of past discussions, particularly around like best practices for writing ggplot extension packages, not just like including, but not just like new ggproto objects, but also sort of generally how better how we might think about propagating better or more uniform design throughout the sort of ggplot ecosystem. So these are sort of my motivations. Okay, so onto the talk. So in the previous version of this talk, I sort of gave like an intro to ggplot2 recap, but you guys obviously don't need that. So I think I'll sort of jump straight into the motivation for the blog post is that I was trying to make sort of calendar visualization with ggplot, and I had seen lots of code floating around and was like, there must be some ways to package this up. So in the previous talk, I sort of talk about like, okay, so if you've got someone else's ggplot or your own ggplot, like how can you reuse it? And like the obvious first one is like just copying and pasting it, right? But this obviously becomes a sort of spot the difference puzzle, right? Wow, it passed me even put answers in. This is great. Oh, are these the right answers? No, I think it should be flip a length. Okay, so past me actually put in the wrong answers. But you have copying and pasting. Another fun thing about ggplot too is that you can store layers as objects or like in lists. So what you can do is you can take this layer, like this call to the function geom_smooth, and just like put it in an object, let's say best fit, and then reuse that object, right? So if you wanted to make multiple ggplots with the same sort of geom_smooth line, you can sort of package that up, give it a name, and then like place it wherever you like. This is really nice if the component is sort of exactly the same every single time. But of course, there's sort of like parameterization and things. And so you might think about like wrapping things into a helper function, right? And what this does is if you take like all the different bits of ggplot and then you sort of like shove it into a helper function. And so then you sort of have this trade-off between convenience and flexibility. So GG Weekly has got, I think, maybe like 100 stars on GitHub, and it's this really nice way of creating sort of planners using ggplot, which like arguably is maybe not even the like intended use case of ggplot, but sometimes when you have a tool, you want to use it for everything. Um, but it makes this really nice printable planner. But customization starts to get a little bit bespoke, let's say, right? So there's lots of different ways to customize things, but you're in a sense learning a new sort of vocabulary. Um, for instance, you've got month text, day number, text size. These are all sort of sensibly named, but these all actually pass down to the same sort of ggplot argument, right? We've got another similar helper function, or rather it does the same thing, but it's got different wrapping, right? So this is the ggcal package. So I went through a lot of different packages on GitHub before sort of deciding to write my own and then deciding to write this blog post. But you can see here, like, it's got a very, very like bespoke data structure and a very sort of parsimonious call, right? So you have to do something funky with your dates and something funky with your fills, but then you get this nice little heat map thing. Okay, so right, ggcal has, I think, actually only two arguments, but from the sort of function signature itself, like you can't actually tell what formats, dates, or fills should be. And then we move on to like calendar, which I think is one of the few packages, these sort of calendar packages that's actually on CRAN as well. And this is sort of like a different question of like why some ggplot extension packages like don't make it to CRAN. So here, I mean, just from this function call, can you tell if it's using ggplot? I mean, like what sort of inputs do you need? What sort of data preparation is being done internally, and what do you have to do, outside of it, right? And these all produce very similar looking calendars, because like a calendar is basically a bunch of tiles next to each other with dates. So the sort of idea I talk about in the blog post is like, okay, so this is somewhat of a like a false saving, right? So you take the nice elegance of ggplot and then you sort of like haphazardly shove it into like a helper function. And you sort of create like this trade-off where instead of saving lines of code, well, you think you've saved lines of code, but you've actually just created these like lists of plot specific arguments, right? So if we go back here, you've got all of these plot specific arguments. And the question is sort of like, okay, like, is this really saving time? And Nick Tierney, in his talk, he talks about this idea of like, rather than don't repeat yourself, it's like, don't reread yourself. And this idea that functions and the like function signatures are sort of like abstractions and sort of expressions of an idea. And just like you can have like elegant expression in writing, you might also think about sort of elegant expression for functions. I cannot remember actually what Pasmi was thinking about here, other than maybe this idea that there's sort of this general way of adapting ggplot to like specific domains, right? So for a time, right, you have a bunch of different approaches like GG Weekly, ggcal, calendar, and like solving the general case is sort of non-trivial. ggGist is actually a great example of this. There's a lot of sort of abstraction going on, and this really requires creating like new ggproto objects and like thinking about how these different like time aware or like sort of probability aware geoms or stats sort of work and how they might work together. Um, and this is clearly like on the other side of writing a helper function, right? Helper functions are supposed to be like easy, fast, sort of like quick and dirty, right? And so like the solution obviously can't be like, okay, like sit down for months and like design like this fully functional modular system for like putting together putting together putting together calendars. Um, okay, so given that we take off the table like just creating like a fully fleshed out like ggplot extension with like all the semantics and all the correctness and everything um, functioning nicely, but you still have a plot that you want to remake. Like, what's the way to go about this where you still retain some of the elegance of the underlying sort of ggplot2 syntax? And this is like purely sort of my suggestion or like my idea. But sort of starting out, I thought like, okay, like I don't have time to fully solve like how like time aware geoms should work, right? Like what should a line do across like, you know, different calendars, or if you've got like a leap year or things like, I don't want to fully solve that problem. I just want to solve like the specific thing that I was doing, which I think was like just trying to map out like I was planning a trip, I think, and I wanted to map out like 3 months and sort of see like where I needed to be, and somehow, you know, using ggplot is sort of more fun than like a calendar or a planner or something. So my sort of design goal was like, okay, I want it to be sort of quick for auto plotting. I want to minimize plot specific arguments. And I want to sort of retain ggplot syntax and error messages, right? So the other thing I didn't mention is like, as soon as you start wrapping things in like helper functions, you start to get like your like error chain and stack sort of can sort of be misleading, or it's like hard to debug and trace when things go wrong. And like ideally, my wrapper function like still retains like it still plays nice with other ggplot2 extension components, right? And I'll show an example of this at the end. So, okay, here was like I made this very long ggplot script to make it does a bunch of things, right? Like I'm sort of putting together travel dates. I'm like what days I'm away, where I'm going to be. I even, yeah, okay. So I made little flags just for fun. I wonder if I actually have the actual image here. Uh, okay, it looks something like this, but with flags. I don't know why I didn't put the actual image in the talk. But point being, there's a lot of sort of stat-y or like preppy calculations that are happening here, right? And most of the calculations are sort of like essentially calculating. So the idea is like I'm trying to hack the facet and layout of ggplot to turn it into a calendar, right? And I like do a bunch of sort of hacky things, like, you know, reversing the scales, fixing the coordinates so you get square tiles, like just a bunch of sort of things. And here I put them in a list, right? And I sort of modify the theme so you don't get like axes and all of this stuff, right? Like, so it looks like a calendar. So in order to, you know, make it sort of convenient, I package this all up into another ggplot2 calendar package. And the idea was like, okay, I just want to be able to like have some dates and create a calendar just like that looks the same as sort of I had set up previously. Okay, so this you get like the really, really quick and dirty, like few inputs and it turns out something, right? And so in a sense, I've like saved the lines of code by like shoving them inside this helper function. Okay, so how do I retain sort of customization. And sort of my I think somewhat clever idea was to use ggplot lists as default inputs, right? So the function interface actually has data arguments. It has facet arguments, right? So like when do you want your week to start? How many rows and columns for the different months. So this is not obviously the number of rows within a month is determined by the number of days, but you might want to lay out your calendar grid in like 4 months in a row, and then the next 4 months, and then the next 4 months or something. So, and then I have a bunch of these default layers, right? So the default geom is a tile and some text. And then the default scale stuff, like this is basically me saying like, these are the hacks that I'm using in order to create this like calendar looking output. And then I have a catch-all other in case there's something else you want to add in. Okay, so how does this actually work internally? Right? So internally, I also try to structure everything in this sort of modular way. And you can probably guess that those lists then get passed into like an internal sort of ggplot call. And so internally, you have data helpers, which actually just do this sort of hacky transformation. I separated these out as data preparation functions, so you can actually look up the documentation for this and sort of like if you want to do something different or if you want to construct the plot slightly differently, you can at least reuse the sort of calculations, right? And then the plot construction is pretty straightforward. I have these sort of like hard-coded calls to variables that get created by the data helpers. And if you want to use faceting to sort of get this layout, there's sort of no real way around this. Like you need some like weekday label and sort of which month week it is to sort of tell ggplot where to place the tiles and the numbers. And then, of course, you need this sort of like facet wrap. And by default, I say like, okay, no labels for X and Y because they're sort of these meaningless like position arguments or variables. And then all the defaults get smushed in like as is, and then I return the base block. So, okay, what if you want to then like customize colors, right? Like, and how does this differ to like the previous thing where it's like, okay, I want to customize the text color of like a particular tile or like the text color for all the numbers or like the tile color, for instance. And then you would have to look to say like, okay, this is like month text color, or you'd look through all of these function arguments and sort of guess which one it is. The idea here is to sort of like show, I don't know, sort of show how the sausage is made. And so what you can do is you can go in and basically copy the default geom list and then change, say, like the color or the text. And so that here is just this change to geom text, and then you can specify a color. And my sort of thought behind this is like everyone knows how geom text works and everyone knows how to like modify it, right? The color argument is sort of consistent across all the sort of base ggplot geoms, and it sort of works as you might expect it to. Then you can also, you know, do these like theme things and sort of change things based on like the particular elements, right? And so this is like obviously not as customized to like elements in the calendar, but you can sort of reuse your knowledge about customizing ggplot. And so this changes the strip. So it went from gray to purple, right? And then the last sort of, if you remember, the last sort of design goal I had is like, I want it to play nice with like other ggplot, cool ggplot stuff, right? And one of these things is like adding interactivity. right? And so the nice thing about putting everything in these sort of like lists is that if you're not hard coding things like inside the helper functions, you can also sort of forego certain you can sort of more easily forego the heaviness of like including other ggplot extension packages inside your own package. Um, so the way this works is that I can just make a default plot using this like GG facet wrap, right? This is like the helper function from my ggtilecal package. Very boring, like data helper, and then like this sort of like auto plot function. But then because it's sort of like nicely behaved, I can, as you always can, but it's sometimes difficult to sort of see what the underlying plot is. I can add interactive additional text. So this is where I like place these emojis. And then I can also from ggiraf add an interactive tile that will give me a tooltip, like a hover over. Right? So that looks like this. Right? And this example is actually included in the documentation for ggtilecal. But if you install ggtilecal, you don't also need to install, you're not forced to install ggiraf. And I think this is sort of clearer in how these two different things sort of interact, right? That it's very clearly like ggtilecal is taking care of just hacking together this calendar layout, and then it still plays very nicely with like the same sort of geom tile interactive, right? So we're putting a tile on top of it, and this inherits all the same like aesthetic, like X and Y mappings that I have sort of created, hacked together for you in GG Facet Wrap. And that's why they're sort of automatically placed in the right, like on the right dates. Cool. So this is all nice in my mind, but I also was thinking about, what's the role of sort of documentation in helping people actually like access, like it's all fine for me to be like, it's super modular and you can customize it. How can like the documentation also support this? So when writing the documentation, I really wanted to sort of highlight and separate the data preparation steps, how the ggplot2 recipe works, like the thing that I've sort of shoved inside this GG facet wrap, and then how to modify the plot, right? And so if we look here, right, it's very like I try to be very clear that like what's actually happening under the hood is that if you give me a list of events, I'm going to pad it with missing days because you essentially need to like pad out the data so that ggplot has something to plot for every tile. Otherwise, you get missing tiles, even though they are in the calendar format. So if you go back here, right, these dates that don't have like anything on them, if you were doing like a list of events, like you have to pad these out somehow. You have to create this data. And then you calculate variables for the actual layout, right? And then it returns a ggplot object. And so here then I explain all the arguments. And then I basically say to the user, like these are fixed components that use the layout variables. Like you can't, I don't let you change this. Like this is sort of like fixed. If you want to change these, you need to write a new ggplot. And so, X is day of the week, Y is week and month, and label is the day of the month. And these are things that I'm sort of like, it's not really like not easy to change. And if you want to change this, you should just start your own new function. But I do then sort of map the ggplot elements to like somewhat meaningful things on the actual calendar, right? So using geom tile and geom text to actually place down the tiles for each day. Scale Y reverse. This is actually a good reminder for me as well, because sometimes I'll go back to my own code and be like, why did I put this random reverse scale thing here? Or like, yeah, fixed coordinates. So, these are like me trying to explain to other people and then also to my future self, like why I did certain things. And then the last point is sort of like how to modify this, right? So like alter these things, and you can actually add additional components. And or if you want to sort of wrap this together, you can use the like other arguments. So in theory, you could build a plot helper on top of this plot helper, um, if you so desired, right? Then I imagine this is like when you're creating lots of very lots of plots that just vary on like say one argument. It is useful to sort of like wrap them um, in, so only like the thing that you're varying is exposed. Um, and yeah, to remove any components, so on and so forth. Okay, so data preparation sets, how things work, how to modify the plots. Okay, so I think basically at the end of the talk, um, like my sort of very opinionated design principles are that we should, as far as possible, always try to sort of retain and expose ggplot syntax and the sort of underlying recipe that is being used. Um, Separate functionality. So like when you're doing things to prepare the data, like sort of hacking, like the layout, or like doing something that's like needs to be done but maybe would be more elegant if it was like packaged up like inside a stat eventually, or something else. You don't have to do it like straight away, but it's nice to keep these things separate. um, and then like document customization in a way that sort of like adheres to ggplot grammar. um, so yeah, like the idea is like, okay, like the helper uses sort of grammatical inputs. You have this modular internals, and then you like document things to sort of be like, okay, here's the mapping to like the sort of domain context, right? So calendars or whatever else you might have in mind. Okay, so like my disclaimer is like, okay, these are like my opinions and rules, but of course, like you're free to break them. I don't think I talked about this on this talk, but one other sort of thought or idea around this is that it actually helped me think about like the different functions and roles of things when dealing with like time information in the context of ggplot, right? So this, I also think of like having this discipline around writing your plot helpers can actually help when you eventually are trying to write like a more fully fledged sort of like new geom or like scale or whatever it is. Cool. All right. That's sort of everything I wanted to say. And yeah, I'll just remind you like my sort of discussion prompts were so firstly, thoughts about teaching this type of idea to like statistical programming students. Like I'm about in like 2 or 3 weeks time, I want to teach some students some of these like core ideas, and I'm thinking about using this example in class. I don't know if maybe it would be too complex because it sort of requires some understanding of ggplot. But also, yeah, any thoughts or links to other GG extenders discussions, and thoughts on like whether and how it would be worthwhile sort of like testing like how much better or like how much more usable this design of plot helper is. So like I sort of imagine like you could test how quickly people might be able to customize the ggplot on like different functions, different helper functions. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia, and thanks for kind of organizing um, organizing our thoughts about what you would find useful in terms of feedback. Yeah, if anybody has questions that they want to jump in with right away, I see big rounds of applause. I feel like, yeah, I really appreciate hearing you kind of tell us about the blog post. I've been aware of it for quite a long time, and then I think I find myself doing some things similar to your ideas, but like I couldn't like necessarily put words to that. So this is really helpful. Okay, I see Michael and then Corey.
Um, Cynthia, thank you for a lovely talk. I have two two questions, comments that I'd like to raise. So, one thing is that the calendar context is a really kind of weird one, unusual one. Um, um, I was thinking as I was listening to you that, oh, is there something like a grammar of graphics for calendars? I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, but it just occurred to me. Um, I was so impressed with the GG Animate package, how it took the idea of animating plots over frames, windows, and time, and developed the ggplot extension for that, kind of on the ideas of an extended grammar of graphics taking animation into account. Um, that's my first thing. Second thing is I'm really interested in the idea of representing information in calendars. And I don't know if you know, but I run a milestones project in the history of data visualization. And so it's all these, um, what Newton did, what the development of um, uh, different visualizations throughout history. And can I just share my screen for a second,
Yeah, sure.
if I can?
I think,
So
oh, uh-huh.
this is a representation of my milestones calendar. It's extracted from the website. It's who was born, who died, what were the events, and this is for January here, and it notes that um, January 8th was the 400th anniversary of Jean Talon's first census and stuff like that. I've always wanted to put that in an actual calendar where I could have links to the stuff on my Milestones website, maybe images, things like that, but in a calendar format. So that would be that's a goal that I've had for a really long time. And if anything that you've done could help me solve that, that would be wonderful.
Okay, let me take these two questions, which are very related. I mean, not so much the core idea of this talk, but I think it's very fitting. So how I ended up working on Duty Time was basically I used to live with Mitch when I was a PhD student at Monash, and I went to him and was like, "Why are there so many ggplot2 extension packages for calendars? Like, why isn't someone made the like be all end all of this?" And Mitch goes, "Well, you'd have to solve the like grammar of graphics for time." And I was like, "Well, I'm not doing that," but I did end up sort of thinking about it. So yeah, the calendar context is very unusual, but if you break it down, it's basically that you have to do a bunch of layout calculations. And like there's more complexity to this, but really like how to integrate these like calendar calculations into ggplot, we've debated a lot and sort of ended up that it's probably, and there's actually examples of this, that it should be a coordinate system because it is a universal like transformation, that actually it makes the most sense for it to be a coordinate layer thing. Developing a functioning like calendar coordinate layer is incredibly non-trivial, right? And so like the answer is like, yes, we have been thinking about this. We've also been thinking about sort of uh, like circular time and like linear time on calendars. It would be nice at some point, I think, maybe closer to once Mitch has submitted, that we come back and do another talk on GG time because, yeah, there's been a lot of exciting things there. On the milestones, is that data set sort of available on the
Yeah,
website?
yes, I've just posted a link, um, and there's a so all the information is in a single database, and
Mm,
but yearly I have to run a script that will update it for 2026. Oh, this is the 400th anniversary. I mean, that's just a very minor thing. But so sometime in the past, I had a graphic person who's kind of laid out, by hand, a
hmm.
calendar, and then, like a real calendar, with a page for every month, and then the details. Um, but um, that's a long-term dream of mine.
Yeah, this is a really cool data set, and I think this is probably not for a group discussion, but I would love to play around with sort of seeing if I could wrap together like a plot helper or something for this using similar ideas, and maybe also then using GG time um, directly.
Great. We
So
we 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 can communicate offline.
yeah, great.
That's wonderful.
Corey.
Hey, yeah, Cynthia, this was great. Thank you. I have another kind of coupling of questions, I guess. One has to do with the use of the period prefixed help arguments that comprise these lists that can be passed to the sort of internal wrapper function. And so far as I could tell from the presentation, from the documentation, it's more or less interchangeable with the idea of using the plus operator to add new layers. I feel like there's some sort of difference there, and I wonder if you could explain, or if there's not a difference, what the benefit of the additional syntactical option is. Um, and then second, you have this period prefixed geom and theme, and I think chord, but there's a conspicuous absence of stats in this package. Not that they're necessarily needed to do what you're trying to do, but there are, I can imagine several instances doing occasional work using EHR derived data where you need indications of like visit time points that are as close as possible to regular intervals, stuff like that. And so it strikes me as a natural extension to build in stats that operate on data that is already pre-processed for a calendar output. And I wonder if any of that's in the works.
Yeah, great. So this period prefix, honestly, I mean, I wrote GG TileCal now like more 2 years ago. No, like a year and a half ago. I'm sure I had a reason for it. I think it was just that I wanted the arguments to sort of signal like this is some sort of default or this is some like there's some packaging around this already. And I think I was thinking about the data, the dot data pronoun that is also in use in the sort of tidyverse. So not being able to go back to past me, I cannot honestly, I cannot fully remember why I had this period prefix. But in terms of why it's not a plus, I don't think you can name our function arguments with the plus.
Hmm.
Um, so I mean that would also be completely valid. It just didn't occur to me to even try that. It seems I've seen arguments with the dot in front of them, and I wanted it to be like sort of a special argument, I guess. Um, and then on the second question of stats, I mean, I think that there's a sort of where do you draw your boundaries, right? And so this is sort of when I mentioned like there's this other idea, like what if you wanted to like put you only wanted to vary like one argument, you could like write a wrapper function on top of this. I think very naturally for some applications, yeah, I would recommend having a sort of dot stat default or something like where you pass it in. But I also feel at that point, at least no, I didn't need it for my specific use case. Um, but I can imagine, say, for your use case, that it could be nice to have that. My question back is like, would you be able to just do that as like a data pre-processing function? Like, and would that not be the place it lives before it goes into a stat in an actual custom geo, right? Like, so I think part of why I left it out is because if you can reason about the stat or things, like it almost, I don't know, I guess it just felt a little bit closer already to making like a custom ggplot geom, or like you're already anyway then doing like the like extension thing. Whereas this was supposed to be more of a like, okay, you might not be that familiar with like how ggplot extensions work and like designing them, but like you can at least keep your data preparation separate in a different function, and then like customize sort of just more. I think I was also looking just mostly to customize how things looked, less so the actual data. Sorry, I hope that answers your question. That was a little bit of
Yeah,
a
yeah. I mean, that's a good point. There's situations where it's enough to have a pre-processing function you can plop down into a geom or layer call, right? And then just like it applies to data, which is a very nice helper that I think gets underused in ggplot2. And there are other situations where you want it to apply to several layers, but not all layers, in which case having a stat companion would be helpful. But either way, I feel like what you've done here is like that there's a salami slicing problem in academia. This is a thick piece of salami, right? You don't need to add anything more to this to justify its existence. So maybe a separate package would be more appropriate if you wanted to do stat extensions with it.
I guess, yeah, I guess I had the same question about the dot prefix. I like the prefixing. Um, I I am curious if it signals in general what dot prefixing signals. Um, I think it's good, but I just wonder from the general audience if because I guess I thought those are internally like created columns. Sometimes that is something that's signaled with that, um, but maybe in this context it wouldn't be confusing. James is raising his hand. One other thing before we go on is I wondered if you would break out the geoms or the stats, if that could allow for like easier like geom1 dot geom1 dot geom2, that would make it easier for people to isolate where the change needs to be made. Otherwise, there may be like copying a lot of code to kind of target a certain change.
Yeah, I would be curious to hear. Like I said, I really can't remember why past me. Maybe I just like the look of the dot prefix. Honestly, I cannot fully remember at this point in time. But I think on the second suggestion you have, I sort of quite, I think of this as a design pattern, not as like a package design, right? The package is simply to illustrate one application of this sort of idea. And I think at the point where you are wanting to do customization at like a geom1, geom2, like write a new geom. Like at that point, you probably should be tying together the geom tile and the geom text, like yourself, or making a new custom geom, right? That sort of bundles these two things together. So I think what's maybe difficult about like this as a, I don't know, like a contribution is that it's sort of more opinion about a design pattern than it is like an exemplar of like this is what you should do, but then I think it also is maybe a teaching or a bridge step in helping people think about like, okay, if you are making a custom geom, like maybe there are these three layers, right? So like if the geom default list had like 5 layers in it. This is like quite extreme, but it had 5 layers in it. But currently for the calendar, it has 2, right? The text and the title. But they had 5, and then naturally 2 of them sort of grouped together, and then another 3 grouped together, and you found yourself changing things in that way, maybe that would lead you to think like, okay, so then I would package these two groups of layers together into like a custom geode. Sort of that's the thought. James.
Yeah, so my question has a lot to do with what you just talked through. So that I'm trying to like reformulate my question now. Thank you for the talk, by the way. This is extremely interesting. I've been working in a problem in my day job that's pretty much like this, but like in a very specific context where we have very predictable data structures that come up clinical trials that come up repeatedly. And we have very standard visualizations for different endpoints, which don't really like entirely work as just like a sort of ggplot2 extension, like, creating a visual for visual acuity involves, like a particular scale, a particular set of geoms, like a particular summary, like summarizing data step, which again doesn't really fall under the extension mechanism. And so we've been working to essentially create these kinds of wrapper functions for very standard data structures. And we've come up against the same problem that you're talking about with this like you have this dot prefix solution, which is, there's actually a lot of power in terms of like the sort of not aesthetic related, but just graphical parameter configuration that you can access in these layer functions, and exporting the sort of ability to specify those graphical parameters in individual geoms in this kind of wrapper function is difficult. So the way that you did it, I was really interested by, and I need to go read through your blog post. It definitely feels very ggplot2y. You're keeping the sort of standard process of specifying those graphical parameters. You're just doing so, and like you're doing it like this control args style. I do have concerns about its sort of like the limitations. For example, like this has been brought up, but if you have like line segments connecting points, and the end user might not think that they have to specify the color in the points and the line segments, or if you were to, like you suggest, just create a new geom, then the end user would have to like know to specify the graphical parameter for your sort of novel geom. Like there's some limitations, but it's also really powerful because it's so flexible. And it demands so little of the developer that's creating this sort of wrapper function. The way that we have come at it is essentially parameterizing all of the potential graphic parameters of interest and actually looking at some sort of like global binding. So maybe having like a hidden global binding that specifies a config for classes of visuals. But that's like very burdensome on the developer. So we kind of hit a dead end. But I'm curious, like, to know as you came up with this dot prefix, were there other programming patterns that you considered? Are there, for maybe that are more flexible but more burdensome, or has this dot prefix really been what you focused on?
Thank you for the comment. Like a lot of things, interesting things. Can I just clarify? By graphical parameters, you mean like color and font size?
Yes.
Like
Yeah, like
yeah, okay.
the GPAR argument ultimately in
Yes.
grid.
Yeah. So I think now again, like when I was the nice thing about calendars being this unusual context, but also a very common unusual context, is like lots of people have tried to write wrapper functions for calendars. Like this is something where like a lot of people have tried to do it. And so in a sense, like what did I study? I studied what other people did, right? Like I sort of wanted to be sure, like before I think about even doing my own custom calendar layout, I sort of hacked together. I didn't mention this, but Nicola Rennie's like a Tidy Tuesday. She made a calendar for like Tidy Tuesday, and I took a lot of the sort of variable calculations from there because unlike the packages in her like blog post, it was really clear like, oh, you're just using like a facet to lay this out, whereas every package I came across, I was like, I don't know how you're achieving this, and so I don't know how to customize it, right? And so I think the way that I did think about this limitation, and the way that I thought about getting around this, right? And again, I sort of say like this is sort of a quick and dirty, like low load on the developer, and often like the developer is me, where I'm like I need to make slight variations of the same plot for like a couple of different talks, or like a publication and a talk, or something, right? Where I'm just like, nah, I just want to tweak the colors a little bit, right? And like I would otherwise be doing copying and pasting. And so like the bar in terms of like what I wanted to achieve is not sort of like full generality, like not so powerful necessarily. But I thought about very explicitly designing documentation for this, right? So if you're like, I want to change the color, you can go into like the idea here is like I wrote in the documentation for this like wrapper function, like, look, these things map to the tile, right? So I actually say like geom tile and geom text are actually in the documentation on the same line. Like they actually are like lumped together. And I sort of leave it to as an exercise for the reader to be like, okay, well, if I want to change color here, I got to change both of these things. And so I think there's, I don't know about sort of this like more, I think there's always a trade-off, right, in terms of flexibility. I mean, like this hidden argument thing and config, right? Like now I almost think about this almost like at like the brand YAML level, right? Where you're like, I just want to have colors that pass through. And I think all of these things are really cool, but sometimes like you want, like the idea for me was just like, I just want this like better than copying and pasting with comments thing. Like this was sort of like my core. And then as I started thinking through the problem, I was like, oh, probably like you can actually get pretty far with just like wrapping the right things together, leaving them open. So like when I come back to reread it, it's still just ggplot, right? Like I don't have to form sort of like chart specific vocabulary that when I go away from this chart and come back to it, I've like forgotten, right? Like, and so I do think it is more tedious, right? Like you will have to change an argument, a graphical parameter in 2 places. But my trade-off there is sort of like lower cognitive burden. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. That's lots to think on. Yeah, so thank you. For the record, the brand.yaml was kind of the inspiration, so you're right on.
I'll ask another question, since I don't see any hands. It's also prefixing. So I'm wondering about prefixing like the user-facing function itself. So I think like my kind of default is when I see something like a function, GG calendar, then I kind of write it off. I'm like, oh, that's gonna do like I'm not gonna be able to parse that. Do you think that there's a way that you can prefix your user-facing function to signal, oh, I'm like what's inside is more composed than the other packages that you compared, which, by the way, the comparative work is really great in this. I really enjoyed that as well.
Yeah. I did kind of, I hadn't thought about this like in these terms, but it would be great to have, I don't know, I always want it to be like GG transparent or something, like as in like the idea here is I'm thinking about designing helper functions on top of grammars that like leave visibility to the underlying grammar, right? Because like you get all this nice power and elegance, but you lose the like one click sort of like convenience, right? And so like as a developer who wants to like have their cake and eat it too, essentially, right? Like I love ggplot, I love how composable it is, I love all of these things. But sometimes I'm just like, I have a task to do and I need to make 5 of the same plot with like something slightly different, or like I just want to change the color, right? And like I don't want to learn a new argument for changing the color for this specific plot type. I don't know. I mean, I ended up using the GG prefix because that's sort of standard. Um, and like, I mean, as some of the comments say, right, like this sort of a standard or generalizable approach to wrappers, part of my motivation for trying to spread this is like, I imagine that this also makes it easier for those of us who are actually developing like fully blown ggplot extensions or like new geoms or new layered types, right? To learn from code that other people have written, right? That if I was to go back to all these other packages and if they had written um, their sort of particular calendar layouts in this manner, I could sort of look at like, oh, okay, this is where it's different, and we might want to parameterize that, or like that you sort of get easier comparison, perhaps, between like different helper functions that might all be special cases of the same sort of underlying grammar extension. Yeah, I think the prefixing part was about the dot, like I used .geom and everyone was asking why I used it, and I actually can't remember. I think it was somewhat inspired by the .data. But I think I wanted to signal like rather than it just being like a geom argument, that it was like a package of a defaulter, like it's the sort of a special object, which is also how I think about .data, is that it's like a special object. Great. Okay, so I think we're at time, and I actually have another thing to go to. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this was awesome, Cynthia. Thank you so much. Yeah, if you need to drop off, that's good. I'll hang out if anybody has anything for the group a little while longer. But yeah, thanks for talking us through the blog post, giving us a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, thank you everyone for the great comments, and Gina for the invitation. It was yeah, fun to sort of talk through some of these ideas.
All right, I'll stop. I'm stopping the recording.